Welcome to Life in LA, a look at people and places in Lower Arkansas, our LA. Lower Arkansas is made up of the 15 southernmost counties in the state. Join us each week as we talk to some of the people who make this part of the world such an interesting place to live. And now, let's join Life in LA with our host, Steve Ford.
Well, here we are down in LA, our Lower Arkansas, and one thing I've thought about is there are all kind of interesting names in the state of Arkansas. You've got places like Booger Hollow, Toad Suck, Pickles Gap, but most of the really interesting names are up in the northern part of the state. But we have some interesting names down in LA, and I thought it would be fun to talk with a local expert on names that could help me figure out where some of these come from. So I've invited Mike G., our county historian and the historian for the South Arkansas Heritage Museum, to help me walk through some of these names. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Steve.
This is podcast number 2 for you. I'm kind of surprised you would accept to do another one.
Well, the first one wasn't so bad.
The first one wasn't. I'm getting to where I really enjoy doing these, and a little bit more relaxed anyway. But we were talking about place names, and we could sit and talk for a long time. Some it's easier to figure out, some are not. A lot of Indian influence just in general in this area.
Some, yeah.
And then some are family names or individual names.
Yes.
I thought it would be fun to, let's start with bodies of water. That'll be bodies of water for 100, Alex. Of course, there are not as many rivers and streams down here. It seems like we've got, I read somewhere that Columbia County, it was before Lake Columbia was built, was the only of the 75 counties that didn't have public access body of water.
Yeah.
But there's 3 major rivers, I guess, that touch Lower Arkansas. You got the Mississippi, how does that go? Mississippi.
Yeah.
Where did that name come from?
I believe that was an Indian name,
Mm-hmm.
but I can't say right exactly.
And then moving east to west, you got the next would be the Oyachita. That's a name that throws a lot of people for a loop, isn't it? The Washita River.
Yeah, that's a Native American name too. It came from the Washita tribe of the Caddo, and that's the French spelling and pronunciation of it. And by the way, Mississippi, that was the Mississippian culture, the
Indian culture,
prevalent Native American culture in this area.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of Indians and bodies of water, the Caddo were prominent in this area. I know there's a Caddo Lake. I don't know if there's a Caddo River. Yes, there is a Caddo River.
Caddo Gap.
I floated it a time or two. You have to stop and think, and but then continue moving east to west. You got the Washita, and then the Red River. Red River. That must have something to do with the color red.
Oh yeah, look at it.
Take one look at it, and you know where
the Spanish named it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that. Well, there's a lot of history involved with the Red River, and unfortunately, we don't have time to get into history. We're just kind of looking at place names and where some of them came from. Then there are a fair number of lakes around here. I used to go. We had a cabin on Lake Erling, and that's a name that's misspelled a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Lake Erling. Where'd that name come from?
The Erling Reese, who was the vice president of International Paper Company.
He was the VP of IP?
Yeah, that's right.
And the name named after him. I talked to a lady from Stamps whose first name was June. I said, "Oh, was the lake named after you?"
Mm-hmm.
And she said, "No, the lake was actually named after the wife of the sawmill captain."
Yeah.
And I guess, I don't know what June's last name would have been way back then. Do you have any information on that?
No, haven't looked into that one, but I can tell you where Stamps came from.
Oh yeah, we'll save that for the towns when we get to them. That's a fascinating one also. You and I talked a little bit about Spirit Lake, which is just adjacent to Louisville, and I read an interesting article on Facebook this week about, of course, Spirit Lake was an oxbow lake that was cut off of the Red River, and then they built dams around it. And at one point, it was a real fishing resort. People would take the train and ride it to Louisville and go fishing there. There were so many coming in. I guess in the early part of the 1900s, they built a hotel there.
Mm-hmm.
And I've read one account of someone who had taken the train from Stevens to Louisville to go fishing all day and then took the train back home.
Yeah, train was a big thing back then.
Those were different days, weren't they? There are some creeks around here. I know in our county we've got some, there's the Nations Creek. I wonder where that name came from.
Probably an early settler named Isaac Nations.
Oh.
He was very early, maybe as early as the 1840s.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that would have been.
He owned property around the creek area, and that's very common. If you see a creek anywhere that has a name that sounds like a surname or a person's name, you can almost always find somebody with that name who owned property there in the early days of the county.
Mm-hmm. Corny Creek.
I have a theory about Corny Creek. There was a gentleman named Cornish, William Foster Cornish, who owned property in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect, language is fluid and people are lazy in their pronunciations.
Oh, yeah.
And I strongly suspect that that's where that name came from. And there's a lot of corny names in that area, probably from that man.
We had rented an apartment from the Shivers out on just off of West Main. I asked him about his name one time. He said, well, our family name used to be Shriver, but our great grandfather enlisted in the Civil War and they left the name out. It was just easier for everyone to change their name accordingly.
Yeah.
Names do change.
They do. Absolutely.
Down through the history. That Corny Creek, that was out where that old cabin was built. I talked to Mr. Jameson and then interviewed Marge Click just around the corner. She said she had to, when she would go play at that cabin with the girls over there, the scariest part was not walking through the woods, but was walking across the log over Corny Creek.
Yeah.
You could wind up in Corny Creek, I guess. Horsehead Creek. I've seen a Horsehead Creek around here.
A lot of these name origins are just lost, but there's legends around some of them, and Horsehead is one of them. Apparently, in the early days, that was a fairly wild area, known to be sort of dangerous because there were bandits and thugs hanging out in there, and they would rob people and kill people. And the story goes, this is just a legend, the story goes that if they killed somebody and took their horse, they wouldn't go around the area with that horse because back in those days, people recognized other people's horses just
like we do cars.
Yeah, exactly. So rather than risk that, they would kill the horses and dump them in the creek so that there were a lot of dead horse heads hanging around in that creek. Now, that's the story.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Let's move into then some of the city names and county names and things like that. The name Magnolia, for example, it's kind of deceptive, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and again, the real reason is lost. It was named by the early county commissioners. One of the commissioners, Norburn Young's fiance, it is said, suggested several names for the new town because Magnolia was invented.
Right.
One of which I think we talked about earlier was Peoria.
Yeah.
It is said. Whether she suggested Magnolia, we don't know. My suspicion is there's a lot of magnolias in the South. There's Magnolia, Mississippi, but it came after Magnolia, Arkansas.
Really?
Yeah, and
Magnolia, Texas.
Yeah. I think there may be a Magnolia, Georgia, too. I'm not sure. But a lot of the early county commissioners, none of them were born here. They all came here in the early 1850s. Some of them came from the area of the country where magnolia trees are indigenous because they are not indigenous here. And, it's just a nice southern name. And that's all we really know.
They had to import the trees that bore the name
That's exactly right.
Planted them all around the courthouse.
Yep.
The magnolia tree.
Yep.
Wild Bay, I think, is in that family, but
It is, yeah.
we'll go chasing that one. There are then some other interesting names. A lot of them are, you'd mentioned maybe were named after other cities where some of these folks had come from. Atlanta.
Yeah, a lot of the settlers in that area came from Georgia, and Atlanta was a prominent city there, even back then. So it's
and
very
Atlanta
common.
was one of the early communities.
One of the earliest, yeah.
Calhoun.
Calhoun was one of the earliest. John C. Calhoun, that was named for him. He was a Southern statesman, politician. He was in Congress, and he was vice president under John Quincy Adams. He was known to champion Southern causes. So he was very popular in the South.
Oh, yeah.
Calhoun County is named after him.
Oh, there's several Calhouns. There's a Calhoun in Louisiana, I believe. Calhoun, the community, Calhoun Road, Calhoun Street. Then there's the other communities in our county, McNeil.
Oh, yeah, McNeil. Of course, McNeil owes its existence to the railroad.
Right.
And it owes its existence to Magnolia's desire to have a railroad through Magnolia, because the original railroad, Texas and St. Louis, didn't come through here. So the city raised money and they built their own branch line. And where that branch line connected at the Texas and St. Louis became McNeil. And it went by, that area went by several different names. It was for a time called Paramore.
Paramore.
Yeah, he was a principal of the railroad. He was a contractor who built the lines. It was called Dixon for a while, for Dave Dixon, who owned a lot of the property along the rail line. But eventually, they settled on the name McNeil for William Berryman McNeil. He was a very prominent local citizen, very involved in local politics and government and whatnot. He started the school at College Hill in 1858, which gave that area its name.
The College Hill area.
That's exactly 1858. He started the College Hill Institute, several miles north of McNeil. So when McNeil was incorporated, they named it in his honor.
You know, I've been a proponent of trying to get the folks in McNeil to change their name to Ralph.
I know your crusade about that.
I'm not making much progress on it, but the thought of being able to say that we live in the Ralph-Waldo-Emerson Triangle of South Arkansas is just so intriguing to me. I don't know how to go about talking with the folks in McNeil. Probably approaching them even is not a good idea.
Yeah, it'd be something like the Bermuda Triangle.
It might be. McNeil's is a great name. Just leave it at McNeil.
Yeah.
You know, I was reading some the other day about the old church building up at, I think it's the Mount Vernon church building that they're talking about moving.
No, Mount Prospect.
Mount Prospect.
Mount Prospect.
Yeah, Mount Prospect. Are you familiar with the community of Richland?
I'm familiar with the name, but I haven't.
The only thing I read in talking about the church building being moved was that the people built. There's quite a community where that church was at one point, and there were stores, there were houses, and the farmland was so good they named it Rich Land.
Yeah.
And it was a growing community until the railroad came through Stevens. And then most of the merchants packed up, moved up to Stevens. And about the only thing left of Richland then was the Mount Prospect?
Mount Prospect.
Yeah. The church there, which is, I guess, one of the oldest buildings.
Yeah, I think so.
Left in the community. So we talked about McNeil. Waldo
and Stevens have a connection. When the railroad came through, and again, Waldo owes its existence primarily to the railroad. They had surveyors who would survey the right of way. The railroad company would also buy land adjacent to these rail lines for depots and to lay out towns. And the surveyors often named them. And we know about Waldo and Stevens because of Wade Hampton Kitchens, who was a U.S. representative from Waldo. He was born in Lamartine, but he claimed Waldo as his home. And in his early days as a lawyer, he actually practiced law in the Philippines.
In the Philippines?
Yeah. He was in the Spanish-American War, so he had been down there. So I don't know why he started in the Philippines, but while there, as a young man, he met an old white-haired gentleman named C.F. Stevens, who told him, once he found that Kitchens was from Waldo, he told him, I named your town. C.F. Stevens was the surveyor that surveyed the line through here. He named Waldo after J.S. Waldo, who was a freight agent for the railroad. And as a matter of fact, you can find J.S. Waldo listed as a general freight agent on census records. So that was an actual person. And this Mr. Stevens also told Kitchens that he located an appropriate place for a depot and named it for himself, Stevens. And this guy also named Buckner.
Oh, Buckner also.
Yeah, he named it after the son of a friend of his that lived in St. Louis. And Buckner was originally known as Barker.
I think Buckner sounds better than Barker.
And when he the railroad bought property around there from a guy named John Colvin and laid out a town, and so he named it after Buckner Fisher, a friend.
Buckner Fisher.
Yeah.
Wow, what kind of friend would name a town after them?
That's a pretty good friend.
That is. You know, a lot of these little railroad stops, and Buckner would have been on the railroad.
Yeah.
Mark Bryan was telling me yesterday about the railroad that went down through Taylor. There was a community not far from there called Experiment.
Yes.
And
I've tried to find. There were some agricultural experimental stations here from the college, and I've often wondered if there was a station near there that gave it its name. But other than that, it's almost impossible to find anything about it.
One of the things that's always fascinated me was that there were once thriving communities in an area, and then for some reason they moved away. When we lived in West Africa, we heard of what had been a community up in the north part of Burkina Faso where some Texans had come over with the idea of raising cattle there, and said for years they had lived there and tried to raise cattle. And just Germantown there near Minden, where you had this community of German people.
Yeah.
And then for some reason, following the Civil War, the community just kind of splintered and everyone went their own way. But to think that at this site, there was once a thriving community, and now maybe all that's left is the name on a map.
That's right. A lot of them were farming communities. That's why they were there. And then when farming and agriculture ceased to be as big a thing, people started moving to cities and working in stores and industry. These little communities that were.
I remember speaking to David Bean over in north of Stamps. He said when he grew up over in that area, it was all cotton and corn, and now it's all pastures and pine trees. It's amazing how the nature of a community can change.
Yeah,
I guess according to the things that go on there. The railroads are still important for transportation, but it seems like trucking has probably surpassed that, maybe on the shorter hauls.
Yeah, I mean, the railroad here had passenger service up until, I think, 1948.
Yeah, that's incredible to think of. I heard that they're talking about Amtrak service starting again from Shreveport to Atlanta.
Yeah.
But we looked into taking Amtrak down to San Antonio. The problem is you'll have a breakdown somewhere, and what should be a 12-hour trip could take days.
Yeah, and they stop at every small town.
It might be a great way to see the USA, but if you're in a hurry to get someplace,
that's not the way.
And then the railroads also impacted. You know, we were talking more about place names, but again, talking to Mark Bryan yesterday, he was talking about the narrow gauge rail lines that came through here strictly to carry lumber,
Right.
logs.
Yeah.
He said they would build the track and they'd stop and harvest the logs all around it, and then they would extend the track a little further. I wondered if Reeder Railroad, I believe it was a narrow gauge.
It was a narrow gauge,
and
I think,
used primarily for hauling timber or lumber.
Yeah, probably.
Where were we?
Well, you mentioned stamps.
Stamps. I'm glad you brought that up because that is a fascinating place name. Tell me how Stamps got its name.
It was named for Henry James Stamps, who came to Lafayette County.
We're going to talk about pronunciation next.
Yeah, he came from Georgia in 1880 to operate the Bodcall lumber mill there. And when the post office was established there, it was named Stamps for him. And the first post mistress was Ella Crowell, who was his daughter.
Huh. Now, here's the fascinating thing I learned about it years ago when I used to collect stamps. That Stamps is the only city in the United States with a post office. And as a result, stamp collectors used to mail their envelopes to Stamps so that they would be canceled on the first day of issue. And
with the name Stamps.
The name would say Stamps on it.
I've read that.
I don't know if they still do that, or I don't know if people collect stamps like they used to. But the cancellation stamp named Stamps was a much sought after.
It was, yeah.
And then you mentioned Bodcall. We didn't talk about that name.
Bodcall and Dorcheat. I need to first say that the reason we know where these names came from is because it's not nearly as well known as the Lewis and Clark expedition, but Thomas Jefferson did send an expedition through here.
Wow.
They went up the Red River. They started in Natchez, Mississippi, and they went up the Red River. It was the Freeman-Custis expedition of 1806. The expedition was cut short because on their way up the Red, they encountered the Spanish, who still claimed there was some territorial dispute, and they shut them down, basically, which is one reason a lot of the history of that expedition is lost, because it became sort of a political embarrassment.
I wonder how far they got. Do you know?
They got up well past Louisville. I know that. Well, they got to a point. There's a point on the river called Spanish Bluff. Well, that's where this incident took place. And that's as far as they got. Yeah. So they were told by a Spanish patrol that there was a larger force on the way. So
could that have been a
Spanish
Bluff?
and so they decided to.
There's a lot of history in that area around the Red River and that part of LA.
Yeah.
I'd love to dig in a little deeper sometime. We don't have time for that.
Well,
today.
Anyway, the journals were published in 1984 by Dan Flores, who was a history professor in Texas. And in those journals, Custis, or Freeman, said that they talked about a creek that was called Badka, Badtka, named by the Indians, by the Caddo Indians. And they also talked about a creek called Dache, also named by the Caddo Indians. You see that name on old maps for Dorcheat.
Dache.
And it's spelled several different ways, Dache, Dachit, Dachet. And it's odd because they said in the journals that name was given the creek by the Indians because the first Indian that passed that way saw a bear gnawing on a log. And that was their name for a chunk bitten out of a log by a bear. That's what they stated in the journals.
Man, I'll need to remember that word in case I find a chunk of log that's been bitten out
there you go.
By a bear. I didn't know there was a specific word for that. But that makes me think there are some other odd names. Well, Lamartine, that's not particularly odd, but it appears to be French looking at it.
It is French. Thomas Dockery, who founded a plantation there in the 1840s, named it for a French poet.
Lamartine.
Yeah, a French poet named, Alphonse de Lamartine. And he was more or less contemporary. He was born in the 1790s and lived until about 1869.
And a lot of folks still live at Lamartine.
Yeah, they do.
Lamartine, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That leads us sort of into pronunciation.
Yeah.
There are some weird, wonderful pronunciations in South Arkansas. I guess it just, I don't know. Why do they call it El Dorado instead of El Dorado?
Who knows? It's just another one of those things, the way language changes.
Mm-hmm. And the county just to the west of Columbia. I've heard it pronounced so many different ways. Lafayette?
Yeah, well,
Lafayette?
It was named for Marquis de Lafayette, who was a French Revolutionary War hero here in this country.
And just above there is Nevada County?
Yeah.
We have our ways of pronouncing things.
The origin has essentially been lost, but one suggestion is, and if you look at it on the map, and this is what some of the history says, that it was named that because it is shaped similar to the state of Nevada, that was founded before the county of Nevada.
Oh, that's fascinating. I had talked to a college student who told me, I think that they were from Arkansas County because the shape of their county was essentially the shape of the state of Arkansas, only in reverse.
Yeah.
I'll have to look that one up to confirm it. Luckily, this is not being saved for all history or all eternity. But pronunciations are interesting. And with the French influence, there's that town over in Union County.
Smackover.
Smackover. Where in the world did...
It is also said that it was French in origin, Smackover Creek, and it on early maps, it is named Chenin Couvert.
Wow.
Meant covered way because of the way the trees
covered over the trail.
And that got mangled and anglicized over the years into Smackover.
Oh, yeah. I think there may be a couple of theories about that, but that's as good a...
Yeah, there's a lot of theories about a lot of these places.
Yeah. We didn't mention Felsenthal. A lot of people go fishing over there.
Yeah.
That's an interesting place name.
Felsenthal began with a gentleman named David Felsenthal, who was born in Germany in 1833, and he came here in 1853. Had several children, and 4 of his sons formed a land and timber company called the Felsenthal Company, and they built a company town for their employees, homes and stores and whatnot, and they named it Felsenthal, and it later became an incorporated town.
The names are important, and you have to be able to pronounce them.
Yeah.
And I guess every people or a geographic group can pronounce their names the way they want to. When we lived in West Africa, I had a friend there that when I told him my name was Steve Ford, he said, I cannot pronounce that. that we do not have those sounds in our language. So he said, I will give you a name in my language that is easier to pronounce for me. And he said, I will call you Wedraugo Etienne.
Oh, my goodness.
And that's so much easier to pronounce than Steve Ford.
It's all into perspective.
I guess, or what you're accustomed to saying. It's said that a baby, when it's first born, can make every sound, even some of the German gutturals. But the older they get, the more set their palate becomes, and some sounds we just cannot make. But if we want to say El Dorado, that's fine.
Yeah.
Any way we want to pronounce it, it's our locale. We can pronounce it what we want, but the people of McNeil will still hear my plea. Would you consider just a small name change to Ralph?
Well, maybe they'll hear this podcast.
Maybe
and think about it.
There's some good news in thinking that. It's also with a degree of trepidation that we think the people in Ralph hear us. The people of McNeil hear us talking this way. We could have problems. Well, Mike, I know there are a lot of other place names we didn't get to, but it's fun thinking about all these names, where they came from, how we pronounce them. That's part of what makes L.A. such a remarkable place to live.
It is, yeah.
But you've done a lot of research. I appreciate your time. And maybe we can get together and finish up some of these other names someday.
Yeah, let's do that because we've got a lot more to talk about.
All right. Thanks so much, Mike.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Life in LA. Feel free to contact us at steveford@gmail.com if you have a suggestion for a future topic. And as always, tell others about this podcast and share it on your favorite social media. You've been listening to Life in LA, a production of Steve Ford Photography.